Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another program here with me, Jim O'Connell, your host. Very happy to have you. If you're watching live right now, it's 6 o'clock on the infamous date of September 11th. And so, welcome. It's been a momentous week in the city of Manchester educationally, with more subjects than we could probably cover in just the hour that we have. But I think the first thing I'd like to do, of course, is to recognise the date it's in at 9/11, and I was just contemplating, that as the years go on, to me and to many of you, I think, listening to this, 9/11 is a date that is in the immediate past, and it's something real in our lives and cathartic in our lives, and we all remember where we were, etc. And when you think it's 17 years ago, and the graduating class from Memorial and Central and West High Schools in Manchester this year, they actually were 1 year old, and some not even that. It was the year of their birth. So for them, it's something they've only ever read about, and it's just extraordinary to think about it like that in the amount of time. It's also extraordinary to think how much our country has changed, and even for that matter, the world has changed in those 17 years. But like many occasions dotted back through the history of our country, some deserve a special mention, and 9/11 is just like the day that lived in infamy, which Roosevelt spoke of in terms of Pearl Harbor. I always think my one quote that I think about for 9/11 was, as many of you who were around at that time will remember, right after 9/11, there were no late night shows or things on television because the country was in shock, and people felt it was inappropriate as it was. But David Letterman was doing the Late Show at that time, and eventually he came on after maybe it was 2 weeks or maybe it was a week, and he came on and said his words were, that was a sucker punch, that the United States was hit at a moment that in a way that it didn't expect, and but I think he summed it up very well, and he was quite somber that night, and it was a sucker punch, and we have spent the intervening 17 years strengthening ourselves, etc. And so, and we should all be grateful to all of those who've been fighting the war on terrorism at home and abroad in the years since then. So let us never forget. The next thing, of course, is today is election day. And it is primary day here in Manchester. There are lots of wonderful candidates who've put their names forward, and without wanting to sound trite, anybody who puts their name forward for public office deserves our thanks. That doesn't mean that they all have policies that are good, and certainly when it comes to education, it doesn't mean that they all have policies that are good. I'll have a guest who will be joining us shortly who we're going to talk about education and politics in the state of New Hampshire. But please, if you're watching this, you have about 55 minutes left to go out and vote. And as much as you might like listening to me or watching me, if you're watching this and you haven't voted, please put down the spaghetti fork and abandon plate, go vote. It won't take a minute. It's especially quiet during these primary dates, but it's not just important to the individuals who are running for offices in our state and across the district, but it's important to all of us, because as we'll be discussing in a minute, we have there's a primary on the governor's side, on the executive council. Very important decisions to be made about who the candidates will be to run for the Carl Shea Porter seat in Congressional District 1, and of course for others the Congressional District 2, which is out of not including Manchester. There's also a decision to be made there. So lots of, and of course the Senate seat. So it's important to get out there and vote. So I want to get on later on. I will be talking about a number of things, in particular the episode or the incident at Central High School that happened this past weekend, and we'll get to that. But before I introduce the guest, I want to do something that I like to do regularly, which is to keep you up to speed with some of the things that are coming up. And the only thing I want to mention tonight is that Dr. Vargas, our superintendent, his coffee and conversation schedule is back up. It's always on mansd.org for you if you wish to have a look at it. But the first one of the year will be on September 12th, which is tomorrow morning at 7:30 a.m. at Western Elementary School on Hanover Street. So if you have something you want to get off your chest, or if you want to hear from Dr. Vargas, that's a wonderful opportunity to have a one-on-one meet with him. And then that's tomorrow morning. And then the following afternoon at Central High School at 4:30 on September 13th. You can meet with Dr. Vargas at 4:30 on the 13th, and that's usually in the library, so I'm presuming it will be on there again. Then as you get into it, we'll deal with the ones later on, but he will be at McDonough and Jewett on the 3rd and 4th of October. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest and thank you for coming on. Hi, Barb. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. This is Barbara Hines, who is with the Rights and Democracy Movement in the state of New Hampshire. Is that correct?
We're a bi-state organization, but I work for the New Hampshire side.
Okay. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, perhaps?
Sure, absolutely. So,
Okay.
I have lived in New Hampshire my whole life. I was born and raised in Pelham. I've been to school in New Hampshire. I got my undergraduate at St. A's in philosophy. I went on to almost become a teacher and to work in schools in a couple different capacities. And eventually I got my master's in public administration with a goal of working in a nonprofit.
We need to turn on the mic. We've got a mic
Sure.
not working.
Turn it around.
Oh, there you go.
All right.
All
Don't
right.
do anything to it or that?
No, that's good.
Okay.
That's my fault.
No problem.
I in my hurry to get you settled, I gave you the wrong side of the microphone. It's a good job I did. We're not in a shooting show or something, because
Right.
you'd be in all kinds of trouble.
Should I start over?
Yeah, briefly. I
Okay,
think a lot
so
of people might have
briefly.
got it, but it was harder to hear.
Sure. So so raised in New Hampshire.
Right.
I did my undergraduate work at St. A's, and then I have a master's in public administration. I've always wanted to work for a nonprofit or with the public service,
Right.
and so I started this year after 6 years working as a special ed secretary, doing this work as the Education Justice Project organizer for Rights and Democracy.
That's a big mouthful. Say that again. The
All right.
Education
Justice Project organizer. So
Okay.
this past year, and I mean, you know, all of the different things that have been happening
Yes.
over the past year in education, the attacks on public education we've had.
Right.
A group of people decided, you know, we need to really put something bigger together. So we're working to build a table, which is a lot of people talking about education and public education, and they said, let's fund a full-time position at RAD. So I'm the
Okay.
one that they asked to take that
Excellent.
position
And
on.
taking one step back from there, Barb. So Rights and Democracy. What is its pedigree? Where does it come from? How is it
Sure.
funded? What is it?
So we're a grassroots nonprofit, and we have a C3 and a C4, which means that we do issue and education work, but we also look to do political work, and so a couple different arenas. We started in Vermont in 2015, but pretty soon after, the people realized we don't have anything happening on a grassroots level in New Hampshire around deep movement politics organizing, where we
Right.
look to really talk to people and understand what's happening in communities and organize people at a very deep level. And so we've been around for a couple years. The most work we've been doing has been around the Transgender Protections Bill and around Medicaid expansion. So we've got some wins in those areas, but we're looking to expand into more areas, including education.
Okay. So then during this election cycle, what is your concentration being? Are you out knocking on doors? Are you holding, I don't know, information sessions or dropping literature? Or what are you doing for this? Well, up until now for the primaries and then going into November.
Sure, and we've looked at everything toward November. So we didn't do any work around areas that had primaries, like contested primaries.
Okay.
But we've been knocking on doors, and a lot of it is that most people in New Hampshire don't know who their state reps are. And if you don't know who your state reps are, you probably don't know how they voted.
Right.
And most people didn't hear about the school voucher bill that just narrowly was defeated last year.
Right.
And so the work we've been doing is knocking on doors and connecting with people in their neighborhoods to let them know who their reps are and how they voted on vouchers, ask them to hold those reps accountable. But we also have a petition that we're doing that we're going to bring to Governor Sununu's desk, because as soon as a school voucher bill was defeated, he turned around and said, well, I'm going to bring it back next year. We're going to keep pushing for it. And we want to show Governor Sununu that that's not what we want in New Hampshire. We want to fund a robust public education for everyone. And starting on September 29th, we're going to be doing an issue campaign organizing meeting. And then we're going to be having house parties through the election and beyond to talk to people about their vision for education in New Hampshire, to find out, everything from how it's funded to what we're actually doing in the classrooms.
Are you proposing a particular solution? I don't mean a discrete solution down to the finer points, but just broad spectrum. So, public education in New Hampshire is the least well-funded public education system in the United States. So do you have, does your organization have thoughts or proposals about how that might be undone or improved?
Well, one thing we've realized, and I don't know if you've had a chance to see any of the work that Councillor Andrew Volinsky and John Tobin have been doing across the state, but they have been doing presentations on how education is funded in New Hampshire. They're the two lawyers that worked on the Claremont 2 case, and there have been dozens of lawsuits in between, but no real fix. And so while we don't have a specific proposal for how to fix the education funding in New Hampshire, we're very aware that depending on where you live in the state, you've got a different education. If you live on the seacoast, or you've got a ski resort, or a lot of great industry, you've got the kind of houses with big tax revenues, so you can have a $6 tax rate and be spending $30,000 without blinking an eye. But in other areas like Berlin, Franklin, Claremont, there are people that it's a low amount of tax dollars they can raise. So they have a much higher tax rate for a lot less money per student. So they're talking about that. And I think the big piece is that for 20 years now, the legislator hasn't been willing to really focus on this and find a solution. And that's what we're asking for. Let's elect people to the the New Hampshire House that are going to really look at this and find a solution.
Because the background, we've discussed it many times on this show, but there's been some of the big picture stuff is that our state legislature has been downshifting costs from the state level, monies that were promised by the state, monies that had previously been funded by the state. And they've been downshifting those costs to the local community. And to the local community, it means basically property taxes, because local communities don't have any other source other than fees, registration fees and other fees and impact fees. But the preponderance of the money is property taxes, and so this incessant, drip, 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 and sometimes not so much drip, 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 more like gulp, gulp, gulp of dropping down costs, and that does need to come to an end. And it's one of the things that. One of the reasons why I like what Rights and Democracy is doing in regard to education, because you're holding people's feet to the fire and saying, we've got to fix this. I am aware that Executive Council member Volinsky has been, he was the guy behind Claremont 2 back in the day, but I know that they've been highlighting, and I've said it numerous times on this program here, that the lack of equity and fairness in the way that education is funded in our state is blatant, and it's just not it's not defendable. clearly, if you take the social demographic or economic status of the towns throughout the state, and it just follows like night after day that the richest towns are able to spend the highest amount. And to the point, just to sort of reiterate what you said, when people talk about tax rates as opposed to funding and all that stuff, it means that in a town where the property values are lower, because of the nature of the way the tax or property taxes work, a much larger percentage of the total spending it has to be spent on schools, because there just isn't enough money. Whereas in a town like, I don't know, Rye, for instance, the percentage that's being spent on schools, even though it might be a lower percentage in actual money terms and in money per student, it's huge. And of course, just to reiterate, and those who've seen this program many times will be tired of me saying it, but I'm going to say it again because I like to say it every week. We do have the city in Manchester. We have the city in the state that spends the least per student of any city in the state of New Hampshire, and we have the highest, although I haven't checked this for this current year because the numbers aren't available, but we've historically had the highest number of students per teacher.
Oh, wow.
So it's terrible. And then to see public representatives from Manchester voting in favour of things like Senate Bill 193. So do you want to, the problem with Senate Bill 193, the problem is that it's a lousy bill. But it's difficult for some people to get their heads around because it changed so much over time. What would be your, if you were to give people the 5 cent tour, how would you describe Senate Bill 193?
Sure. So I would also talk about it in context of what's happening across the United States. So what we're seeing is Americans for Prosperity, which is one of the Koch brothers PACs, is basically state by state trying to put in pieces that dismantle public education and send money to private schools. And I think they're doing it because for them, anything that's a public good, they're basically they're saying, but nobody's making a profit on it. So why do we have this? And for so many of us that want public goods, as we see it, like every child deserves to get an education, and that we want to work together to fund that. And we don't need someone to profit. We just want to have a good school system. So SB 193 is one of those salvos to try to say, how can we take some money from public schools and start to funnel that into private schools and into religious schools? And nobody has a problem with people choosing where they want to go. And I think it's not fair for the proponents of a voucher bill to say it's about school choice. Everybody has school choice. But for us to basically say that we're going to ask taxpayers to pay for people to go to these schools, I think is the big problem. And I go back to the whole idea. I mean, we were founded on, no taxation without representation. And so I own a condo with my husband in Londonderry, and we're happy to pay our property taxes. We don't have kids, but as I see it, it's so important that to have all of our kids get the best education possible is going to make us a better state and a better place to live in. And I can show up to school board meetings, and I can say if I like what's going on or I don't. I can run for my local school board. I can show up and vote. Exactly. I'm there when the budget is put together. I show up and I vote on that budget. So I might have a problem with how things are done, but I've had a chance to put my say in all of the way. With private schools and religious schools, we're not allowed to do that. I can't show up and say, I don't like what's going on. If I disagree with what's being taught, with what my dollars are being spent on, I don't have a say there. So it's basically taxation without representation.
And then, am I right in thinking, and I don't know this, I'm surprised it hasn't occurred to me previously, but in the case of public charter schools, which is something different, in the case of public charter schools, what rights do citizens have to I mean, they don't hold public for. I mean,
Yes, they do. So public charter schools,
Yeah.
and that's a whole other conversation,
Yes,
I
it's
would
a
say.
different thing, yeah.
But so they, so if you think about like the right to know laws, so
Right.
every, if you've got a town select board or you've got a school board, they have to have public meetings. People can show up and provide public input, and so our charter schools, their boards are run the same way. So the board has to put out their agenda and where they're going to meet, so many
Okay.
days ahead, and they have to follow right to know the same way that public schools do.
Right, but the choice of the people who are on the boards of a charter school.
You know what? I'm not sure, but I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
anyone's allowed to put their name in. So, like, if I wanted
yeah.
to be on a board of a charter school, there is an avenue for me to do that.
I got to check that out because
yeah.
yeah. But anyway, so the idea of taking public funds, tax money to pay for private and religious schools is anathema to our constitutional view.
Absolutely.
It makes no sense whatsoever. And I have to say that I've heard people make excuses for voting for Senate Bill 193. And just to be clear, this bill was defeated, but only very narrowly.
5 votes.
And it was touch and go. And in order to get the bill passed, the majority in Concord watered this bill down because originally it was an atrocious assault on public education, and they whittled it away, and they kept whittling it away so that it wouldn't have such a huge economic or fiscal impact on the budget. And it was still going to have a big impact. The impact in the first year in Manchester was thought to be around $3 million less for the city of Manchester. So. It seems that but it was very complicated, and so people found it difficult to get their heads around. But through all that malaise or all that sort of confusion, it's clear that if you look at the private schools in the state of New Hampshire. In the end, the people who can afford, $10,000, or in some cases, we have private schools in Manchester that are $28,000 to $30,000 per year per student, and the people who are paying the $28,000 or $30,000 per year for their student to go there, those are not the average taxpayers of Manchester, and so to be giving them, the equivalent of $3,500 to $5,500 a year. Seems to me ridiculous when the people who will be paying it are the people who work perhaps in Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's or on minimum wage of $8 an hour. Although to be fair, I guess people who earn $8 an hour don't pay an awful lot of taxes. But I don't want to be
Well, I would say if you look at it, is that when it comes to property taxes, either you own a home and you're paying property taxes that way, or
Right.
you're renting and your landlord is paying property
taxes.
taxes. So you're paying rent.
Right.
So whatever happens, everybody, I would say, is paying property taxes, and really, it's. As I see it, it's inequitable because, it's how much property you have. So you could, have a house with, a family, and you're paying the same amount in property taxes to a similar house, whether
Right.
you work a minimum wage job or whether you're making $200,000 a
Right,
year.
right,
So, yeah.
Right, and the other thing is that for many, again, this goes to sort of the middle class, and for the middle class in America, a lot of their wealth is tied up in their property. So the one thing that they have most, the thing of greatest value by far, is their house, and that might represent a huge proportion of their net worth if they're lucky enough to own a house.
Right.
And then if as you go further up through the middle class, you'll find people with 401ks, some people with 50 or 60,000 in it, some with substantially more as you move up. But the people at the upper end of the value chain, so to speak, their property is a very small proportion of their total wealth, because if you're worth 10 million, and your house is worth $1 million, that's 10% of your total net worth. Whereas somebody living in a $250,000 house that they are lucky enough to have paid for over a lifetime and have $100,000 or $250,000 saved for retirement, their property is 50% of their value, and they're being taxed on that 50% and paying it out on 50%.
And what I found, so knocking on doors, is I've talked to a lot of people who bought their houses when houses only cost $20,000 or $30,000,
Right.
and they've been in their homes for decades, and now they're retired. And so, and a lot of their home, it has to do with sweat equity. They've put on an addition or they've done the work, and over time, their houses have gone up. I mean, sometimes a couple $100,000.
Right,
So
right.
now they're retired and they're paying property taxes on this big house and don't have the income to match it. So.
The numbers, the most recent numbers of property prices in New Hampshire are very surprising to me. No, actually, that's not true. I've expected this and seen it sort of come on, but I think they're surprising to a lot of people. The average house sales price in Portsmouth for the second 3 months of 2018 was $508,000. That's the average house sales price. You can go, ladies and gentlemen, on Realtor.com or Zillow or other websites, and you can be careful which number you're looking at, whether it's the number for the houses currently on the market. Sometimes there are anomalies and things, but the big picture would be if you go and you look at these things right now, and you will see that and the Portsmouth numbers don't include Rye or Newcastle. This is just Portsmouth. So we're not trying to play any games. Sadly, in the case of Manchester property prices are not rising at the same rate as properties in Nashua and Salem and Portsmouth are. And I contend that the primary reason for that, and ask any realtor and they'll tell you, is because people are loath to move to Manchester because of the public education, which is sad because there are so many great schools in Manchester doing so many great things. But people can see that this battle is going on and on and on. And let me go back to so 193. You handed me a piece of literature that you've been handing out.
Sure,
With
yeah.
regard to S Bill 193, and it says some of your state representatives support public education. And on here you have Amanda Boulden, Chris Hebert, and Ben Baroudi.
Mm-hmm.
So you're sort of are you endorsing
No,
them?
we're
or
not.
What
So,
do you,
so basically, what we're looking to do is just let people know how they voted. So,
Okay.
if you go online, as you know, to the general court
Right.
to try to figure out how somebody voted on an issue
Right.
in the state house, you almost need a master's degree to do
Right,
it.
right.
So, what we look to do is just let people know on this issue of vouchers, when it shook out, who voted to protect public funding and said no to those vouchers,
Right.
and who voted for those vouchers, and then to let voters be part of the process of holding their reps accountable by
Right.
reaching out. And that's part of the work we're doing. We want people to feel
Right.
involved in democracy and feel like they can just call their reps up or email them
Right.
and say, hey, this is an important issue to me. Why did you vote this way?
Right, and and there's no better. Back to this, ladies and gentlemen. It's 6:27. The polls close in 33 minutes. Get out and vote. The turnout. I don't know what the numbers were like today, but the turnout is notoriously low in primary elections, especially if you find yourself in the age group under 25. Whatever your politics are, I know how I'd like you to vote, but whatever your politics are, you're hugely underrepresented. And so every vote matters so much more in that age group because of the numbers that vote. I saw them a couple of weeks back, and of the people expecting to vote in those age groups, and it was kind of sad actually. So Barb, on the back of this piece of information then you sent out, you've listed Kathleen Souza and Lisa Freeman as two people who voted, you say supported SB 193, which would have weakened our public schools.
Mm-hmm.
I'm familiar with Lisa Freeman. She's a school board member in Manchester. And Kathleen Souza is, what area is she from?
So both of them are state reps,
Right.
and in one of the wards in Manchester.
Okay, so Kathleen is as well. The name's I'm sorry. Excuse me if Kathleen Souza or her supporters are listening. I apologize for not.
Well, it might not be your
recognizing-
ward.
Yes, it's not. I know it's not my ward.
And even in your
Yeah.
ward, you might. I mean, we're
Right.
finding a lot of people don't even know the reps for their ward, so don't feel bad about
yes,
that.
thank you. So give us all a pass. It is sad because I am strongly against the 400 member house. It just seems ridiculous to me. The barrier to entry is crazy, and we only have to see. And I don't mean to be derogatory or unkind to our public representatives, but you only have to look at the long litany of misfits, strange behaviored people, there's been a lot of really, wacko people find themselves in the last number of years. And that doesn't mean there aren't lots of wonderful people. There are. But I just don't like the whole 400 in a state like New Hampshire. Having all these representatives is just nobody can keep track of it. You don't know who you have. I wanted to I mentioned Kathleen Souza and Lisa Freeman because Lisa's on the school board, and this goes back to how one feels about 193. Because if she were sitting here, and I'd like her to come, I need to give her a ring and give her an opportunity to come in and explain. Because it seems to me simple that a vote for 193 is a vote against public education, but I know that she believes it's not. So
I'm not
this is
sure.
the confusion.
Yeah, and I think one question that I have for different school board members, and this goes back to when I was in school as a kid. So my mom was on my local school board and was the chair of the school board, I think, for about a decade. All told,
Right.
She was on. I'd have to check.
In which town?
In Pelham,
Pelham?
New Hampshire.
Okay.
And so, what we found is that it's not just people who want better public education that run for office. Like there
Right.
are wonderful people that run for office because they want to do great things and they
Right.
want to build something. But just as often, we're finding people run for different boards because they're looking to get something out of it themselves, or because
Right.
they feel like that's their way to bring things down. So when I was growing up, we looked at building a cooperative high school in Pelham and Wyndham. Wyndham overwhelmingly supported it. It was like 98%.
Right.
And we had a group of people in Pelham, including people that eventually ran for the school board, who saw it as an attack. And so instead of us having, I don't know if you've been to Wyndham High School, but it's a wonderful
have not.
school. Yeah.
I know. I actually have. I just don't recall it because
Recall
I've
it,
been there
yeah.
for basketball games. But
Sure, so
they
it's-
all just in my
blur
head,
together, yeah,
I got this
after a
little
while.
15-watt brain, and
Yeah.
that's a 20-watt memory thing.
But we could have really had, a great cooperative school. And if you look at, the economies of scale, if you're
Right.
able to have a couple towns that are, on the medium side get together, and we were really excited. But there was a group of people, they call themselves the People for the Preservation of Pelham,
Right.
and they were afraid that like Wyndham would just tell us what to do, and
Right.
that wasn't the case.
Well, we have,
but
we have
they-
people in Manchester who who have run for public office, who are committed either overtly or not to perhaps the destruction of public schools. Might be stating it too strongly, but are not big fans of public schools, and are on the record as having said that the current system needs to be broken and torn down in order to build something new. And of course, the something new they'd like to build would be, some Ayn Rand dream of, anyway.
Yeah.
So,
So you just have to. I think you have to ask everyone separately. Why
Yeah,
are you
yeah.
running for this?
Right,
Why are you
right.
on this board?
but we have had people, and we have a current school board member right now who has been very forthright in his belief that that he's not on the board to represent just public schools, but rather he's there to represent the taxpayers. All children in all schools, public and private, and the taxpayers writ large and citizens. And so he just happens to be on the school board, but he feels the obligation to everybody. Now, everybody would say they have an obligation to taxpayers and voters, etc. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. It'd be silly to sort of rail against it. But if your mindset is, if you're, I don't want to try and use analogies, but you're on the board to you sort of have a fiduciary obligation to do what is best for the public schools, and it's the job of the alderman in the end to decide, because they are the ones who decide what the taxes will be or what the budget will be and the result of taxes. So, Barb, I'm going to move on. I appreciate you coming in because I
Sure.
want to talk about some of the stuff from what happened on Friday night in Manchester with regard to Central High School. I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you. I would love to
Thank
just
you very
end
much.
with our
Please,
petition.
yes,
Yeah.
and take a few moments if you want.
Sure. So basically, we're inviting people, if you want to, fight against vouchers, you want to support public schools, you want to be part of showing up. We have an online petition, so you can go to our website, which is radnh.org, radnh.org, and under
Okay.
our work, you'll see Defend Public Ed. So that that's the page that I have, and there's an opportunity to sign our petition, to leave a comment for why you support public education or why you think we shouldn't have vouchers. And there's a spot if you want to volunteer for anything. So part of that is if people want to come out and knock doors with me and talk to
Right.
people, we love that. But a lot of the bigger work is spreading the word, because most people haven't heard about these vouchers. And a lot of things happen in this state without the public knowing.
The clear-eyed idea.
And
Yep.
we want the public to know this is what's happening and this is the work we're doing. And then we're going to have information on September 29th event. And we welcome people to come out and share their vision for schools in New
And
Hampshire.
where's the event on September 29th?
So it's going to be one of 2 libraries, but we're still nailing down the location. So, but it's in the Manchester area.
But if someone goes to the website again is
radnh.org.
.org.
And my email is barb@radnh.org. And I welcome people to send me an email. Let me know how they
And I'm
think.
sure you're on Facebook and other social media.
Absolutely. Yes,
Great.
as well.
Well, Barb, we'll have to have you back another day. I'm sorry that we're a little bit constrained for time today.
Given me more time
but
than I
thank you.
expected,
Thank you.
so I
you're
love
very
this.
welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break for a moment, and we'll be back in 2 minutes. Thank you. Bye now. Barb, thank you. Hi, folks, and welcome back to Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. It was great having Barb here. She's out there doing the work, and the great thing about the state of New Hampshire is that if you're interested in policy and politics, you're at ground zero a lot of the time. And in this election today, and you still have 24 minutes to get out there and vote, and I encourage you to do so. But we have a very important. All elections are important, right? So there's a primary on the Democratic side for governor amongst 2 with some great candidates. There's also a primary at the Executive Council level on both the Republican and Democratic side. We have Ted Gatsas from Manchester running against Jane Cormier, I think, and then Gray Chenoweth versus former alderman in New Hampshire from Manchester, Garth Corvo. I won't go through the whole list because it would take too long, but there are 11 candidates running on the Democratic side for a congressional district seat to take over from Carl Shea Porter, with Chris Pappas sort of leading the way there. It appears, but he is, of course, our former executive councillor and another wonderful Manchester man. So, and then you've got our state reps, and they really are very important. And oftentimes, people go down the ballot, they get the state reps, and their eyes cloud over. Also, current alderman Bill Barry is running for sheriff, Hillsborough County Sheriff, and that's a write-in name. So his name's not on the ballot, but he has said that he will run. So if you're going to the elections in the next half an hour, and you could write in my good friend Bill Barry's name on the write-in ballot. So whatever you do, and whoever whether your politics are like mine or other people's, whatever it may be, get out and vote, please. It's just that important. I'd like to take a minute to talk about the episode, the situation. at Central High School on last Friday night, and I guess most people have sort of heard the details of it, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time recounting it. But for those of you who didn't, there was a shooting incident about 2 blocks from Central High School on Friday morning at around about 11 o'clock. The school was put into, and I don't. There are different stages. There's lockdown. There's stay in play, remain in place. There are various levels of security in our school buildings, and so I don't want to misname which steps were taken at which time. But ultimately, the students were retained within the school building, and they didn't move from class to class, starting at shortly after that, maybe 11:30 or something. And as it turns out, it progressed into the afternoon and then into the evening, and it was about 8:30 when the all clear was given, or at least a tentative all clear. And the plan was, and what did happen was, students were bused to Hillside Middle School on Reservoir Avenue, and parents were informed that they could come there and pick them up there. So I just have to say that first of all, I'm taking the premise that the police precaution was the right thing to do, and that the call they made was correct. I'm in no position to second guess it, and so I have faith in our police department. And if our police chief felt that was the right course of action, then who are we to second guess him? It is thought that, or it is said that the house that the shooter was holed up in was within line of sight of some part of Central, and so the decision was made to lock down Central. There was also a case made that releasing students from Central, that the majority of them, or a large portion of them, would be, as they are released onto the streets that they would be traversing were would have gone right through the area that was that had strong police activity in it. So without, I think it's important for people in the city to note a number of things. And I spoke very briefly at the school board meeting last night, which doesn't come easily to me, but I did. And primarily, I wanted to thank everybody involved in the entire process, because there's great selflessness that was to be seen on Friday night, and the efforts and the care and the attention that the administration and principals and vice principals and school teachers, the staff, the kitchen staff, the janitorial staff, everybody. There were so many people involved, and it's very easy to sort of tut it in one sense. And but if you think about the logistics of all of that, you have kids in a school, and some of them required medications. Usually they have their medications in school if necessary, but when you've got 1,500 kids, then that's a large population. There was the kids needed to be something had to be put in place to feed them, and I saw somebody. An article in the Union Leader, something that was said there, and they were just quoting some young people who said something, but they talked about that they were given ham sandwiches, and that wasn't fair to people of some religious faiths, like people of the Jewish faith or Muslims. The truth of the matter is that there were alternatives available, whatever, I don't know what it was vegetarian sandwiches or what it might have been, but the school district did put in place alternative food for kids. That's a very fine little point, but it gives you the level of care that was taken. And all of this is done in a school system that is woefully inadequately funded. And I know people hate to hear that, but we heard it last night with regard to programs and special ed and other things, that just programs are not in place. There's a lack of robustness in the system, and we've stripped down administration, and we've stripped down the number of teachers, etc. And so there isn't a lot of extra capacity there. But despite all of that, and despite the fact that teachers are currently working without a contract, they haven't had any increase in pay. They don't know when they might get one, and yet not alone were the central school teachers putting in 15 hours of work. But teachers came in from other schools. And if you were on the streets of Manchester on Friday night at 9:30, and you're looking at people who had been at work since 6 or 6:30 or 7 a.m. that morning, and there they are directing traffic, organizing buses, explaining to parents. And it was wonderful to see people from across the city. It wasn't just the central leadership that was there, but our good friends, my good friends at Hillside, Mr. McCafferty and others were there, which was to be expected since Hillside was the school of choice. But also, the principals from the other middle schools were there. I saw Mr. Dishard, the principal of West High School, was there. Laura Lord, the vice principal at West, was over there directing buses. So it was just a wonderful community reaction. And last night even, I'd spoken at the start of the meeting and expressed my gratitude on behalf of my family and for they keeping my child safe. But then when you look into that a little more than that, and you see that it involved the kitchen staff, obviously, but then the bus driver. Bus drivers had to be found. The MTA had to scramble and find people and get that organised. It's easy to say, but all of that actually had to happen. You had kids who were coded, or kids with disabilities, or kids with anxiety issues, and kids on the spectrum, and so we all know, those of us who know a little about some of those issues. We do know that disruptions can be very major things in the life of a kid with particular disorders, and so all of that has to be managed and has to be thought about. And I think they did a wonderful job. I'm hoping that there will be a lessons learned. The first thing I have said is to say that. Great job, everybody. Wonderful to see Manchester put its, come together collectively. And let me just say this, which is very important. And I said this last night too, is that ultimately the students deserve great credit. Because as many of you, you think about if you've ever had a few teenagers around your house for some occasion, once you get beyond 5 or 6 of them, things can get a little unruly, and somebody needs to be tamped down and told to, hey, relax a little bit, or not always, but all of us can imagine what it's like to manage 20 teenagers. Well, having 1,500 or so teenagers, or whatever the number was, and seeing them generally well behaved, orderly, there was no tomfoolery, there was no disruption. It was that, to me, was a great commendation for our schools and our school system, and for our teachers, and for the discipline in our schools. Anybody who thinks that public schools in Manchester are not run to a very high standard would only have had to come on Friday night and see students getting off of buses and doing so respectfully and in an orderly manner, and listening to instruction and doing what they were asked to do. And then, they were in the gymnasium and in the cafeteria and entertaining themselves and chatting and talking and etc. It was a pleasure to see. So I think it was a great advertisement for the Manchester public school system, and for the children of Manchester. I do think that, and I do hope that some lessons learned exercise is done as a result of this, because we don't know the full set of thinking that that went on. I think it's important not to fall into the trap of imagining that our massive brains that we have as individuals, that somehow we have the answer that others should have been able to work out because it was so obvious to us. And I found myself falling into that trap on Friday night when I was saying, why wouldn't they have gone to Gill Stadium where there was more room and whatever else? And of course, it turns out that those things were considered, and they considered multiple choices, and in the end they chose Hillside. And so, but as it turns out, the logistics there were a little difficult. In the end, everybody was safe, and that's what's important. But I was thinking to myself that, God forbid, if we ever had an active shooter incidents where there was something actually, however terrible it is to contemplate, if something was to happen in our schools, then the level of angst and emotion and anxiety and fear amongst parents would have been elevated to the nth degree. And then the need for concise and precise communication would have been the most important thing. So I think there are lessons to be learned there. It is true, the communication from the school district was good, better than I've ever seen it before, in that messages were going out, both automated phone calls. It was wonderful to get a robocall that wasn't just everything's okay and we'll talk to you later, but rather said, this is what's happening now, and this is what we're doing next, and this is how it's going to go. I thought that was a wonderful I was going to say innovation. It's not an innovation, but a wonderful execution of keeping people informed. And so long as people are communicated with, I think that the fear and anxiety and a temptation to panic, etc., is lessened. But bringing 1,500 kids to a school like Hillside and then not having a distribution system for them well thought out was a problem, and there were some traffic problems with regard to buses were to go in one side of the school, swing around the school, and come out the other side, and some bus drivers went the opposite way, so then there was a bottleneck that needed to be undone, and these are very understandable things, but I think it's this occasion on Friday night is a wonderful instance to capture lessons learned, so that we have a smooth operation in place if and when, and hopefully it will never be fully required, if and when it's needed again. And then clearly, this is not a simple problem, because the complexity of it includes the nature of what the circumstances might be. So one can only generally plan for things, because oftentimes one's actions will be dictated by the particular circumstance. Clearly, the way in which you manage an elementary school or a pre-K is going to be much different from the way that you would propose to manage middle school, and again would be different from the way in which you would manage a high school. And so that's sort of a very 10,000-foot view level, but that's something that I hope we learn. The other thing is that I think it would be good to spend some time thinking about the fact that 99 or 90 whatever percent, I don't know what the number is, but the vast majority of young people in that school on Friday had access to a phone. And a smartphone at that, and so they're able to text and Instagram and Facebook and FaceTime and every other kind of social media and communication method you can imagine, and so when you have 1,500 parents or so being asked to pick up 1,500 students, and the parents are able to talk to the students, I think some some thought should be given to that it's not it would be easier to sort of organize through that rather than trying to impose a sort of a roadblock that says we have the information, we're going to hold it onto ourselves and let us distribute it to you. I think sort of empowering both sides might have some value to it. On the other side, if you were dealing with elementary schools or something, it's a much different problem. Ladies and gentlemen, you've still got 7 minutes left to go to. 4 minutes left for people. I forget we run a minute or two behind here. So in real time, you have about 4 minutes now, 3.5 to get to a poll. So if you're a really good sprinter, you could probably make it. And so we'll talk next week about what might have happened today with regard to the elections. So again, my admiration and kudos go to the teachers and police and other people involved in that whole episode, including everybody, and some people we haven't named. I would like to note at the end of what we're dealing with here the fact that the teachers there, we haven't seen fit to find a contract for teachers. Discussions are at an end, and so. It's uneasy on the conscience to have people out on the streets of Manchester working 15 hours or 14 hours and not getting paid, and the unfairness of the fact that you have, and this is not about the police. The police were doing a difficult job, and but there were somebody told me 100 of them there. But to have a police officer directing traffic in one street and a school teacher directing traffic on the next street, and the police officer is there on overtime, earning time and a half or double time, earning twice the salary at a minimum of what the basic teacher is earning, and so the disparity between the two is glaring. We read this week that the average pay increase for this past 12 months, for the most recent 12-month period, in the United States was 2.9%. Is what the average pay increase has been across the United States. Now, it seems that to hold the line on zero increase for teachers in the face of those numbers just seems all wrong to me, and I hope wiser heads can prevail, and that the city can sit down with the teachers and find a resolution. We have wonderful people in our city, and they deserve to be treated with respect and to be valued. And this artificial tax cap that says we've got to hold our city, in a chokehold financially because we refuse to see that we've got a growing city and a dynamic city and an exciting city and a diverse school system that is growing in complexity. We have the challenges that we heard about last night of the opioid crisis, which is now being seen in our schools as kids come into our schools who've been born of opiate addicted parents. And it's having a real effect. We saw last night that in 20% of kids in Manchester schools are in one form of special education or another, as opposed to the state average, which is 14. And so in the face of that, the City of Manchester has to make up its mind that it actually wants good schools, wants to value schools, and part of good schools is great teachers. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have voted, and I look forward to another great week in the City of Manchester. I hope it's uneventful, and we'll see you all again next week. Thank you from Jim O'Connell. Good night.